Why doesn't the UFC feel the same anymore? Fighting is the most raw form of competition. Compared to other sports, there are effectively no rules. It's just you and your opponent locked in a cage, and the last man standing wins. All you have is your skills, your strength, and your heart, and the fans can feel that energy. When you're watching your favorite fighter, it almost feels like you're watching them in some kind of life or death scenario. When they win, it feels like they've accomplished something more than just winning a game. They conquered a real threat. The inherent danger of fighting makes the highs higher and the lows lower than any other sport. That energy is the magic that makes MMA and the UFC so special. But right now, this energy is missing in most of the fights that the UFC puts on, like at least 95% of them. Especially within the last year, I've noticed a growing sentiment that the UFC has lost the magic that it once had. Something about it just feels so stale, like it's lost its character and it's just a corporate shell of what it once was. The roster has plenty of talented fighters, and yet all the hype just seems to be non-existent. Imagine yourself in December of 2015 on the day of UFC 194, McGregor versus Aldo. Can you think of a time in the last 5 years where the anticipation for a fight has been as high as it was then? Besides other McGregor fights. Maybe Adesanya versus Pereira, but even that's kind of a stretch. How many fights can you think of in this year alone in 2025 that you're genuinely hyped for? Like you'll watch the embedded episodes and you'll clear out your entire calendar on that Saturday, just off the top of your head. Maybe Topuria versus Charles, or Dricus du Plessis versus Hamzat. Somewhere down the road, maybe Jones versus Aspinall, but that's about it. Which is insane because there are 13 pay-per-views a year and 10 to 12 fights per weekend. That's a lot of fights that frankly most people don't care about at all. $80 is a steep price to watch these events, so the fans need to be pretty invested in them in order to fork over that kind of money when they could just stream it illegally for free. A while back, there was a New York Post reporter who spoke with someone close to some of the fighters, and he was told that the numbers are going down. Now, this isn't official because the UFC isn't super transparent about pay-per-view sales, but I believe it. Many would probably agree that the UFC is in kind of a low point. So how can the UFC solve this? Conor McGregor was a dream come true for the UFC because he was so good at promoting himself, but they can't wait around for someone like him to show up to bring life back to the sport. I believe there are changes the company needs to make in order to reach its potential. There are two problems that contribute to this, and the UFC has to address both of them. Number one, the fights aren't entertaining enough. The UFC needs to make their fights entertaining to the hardcore and casual fans. And right now, a lot of their fights are entertaining to either of them, so people just aren't watching them. And I believe the entertainment value of the fights is directly related to the way the fighters are paid, and I'll explain how shortly. Number two, the pay-per-view model. The real problem here is the value of the pay-per-views. People simply aren't willing to spend $80 for UFC events. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the first problem, because if the events had more entertainment value, it would justify a higher price. The reality is, the fights probably have to get better, and the price probably has to get a little lower to not price out a majority of the fan base. So let's start with problem number one. The fights aren't entertaining enough. What makes a fight entertaining? I'm not talking about the kind of thing that makes street beefs entertaining. If you want that, that's what Power Slap is for. By entertaining, I mean a fight that has that fighting spirit that I was talking about earlier. Those fights that have you at the edge of your seat and your heart racing. These are the fights that when they get announced, you mark them on your calendar. And I believe it comes down to two things. The first thing is that there has to be an expectation that either fighter, or even just one of the fighters, can get a finish. That could be a submission or a knockout. Because that's the factor that makes the stakes feel so high for a fight beyond just winning and losing and going up and down in rankings. And the second thing is that the fight has to be competitive. Each fighter has to be a real threat to each other, otherwise you basically know the result ahead of time and it takes away a lot of the intrigue. And to a certain extent, the UFC knows this. Right now, each fighter is guaranteed a certain amount of money per fight, regardless of the result. And that amount is more or less dependent on how long you've been in the UFC. But if you win, that amount usually doubles. On its face, this makes sense. You want to incentivize fighters to win, otherwise they'll just fight passively and try to minimize damage as much as possible and skirt off with their money. Because typically speaking, the more aggressive you are, the greater ability you have to inflict damage offensively, but it also increases your risk of getting countered and losing. This is why fighters who get finishes consistently are more impressive to me than fighters who can just win consistently. Because it shows that they're capable of putting themselves in danger, but they have the skills to get the better end of those exchanges. MMA is a sport, so obviously they can't make every fight go until somebody gets a finish. They have to have time limits and a scoring system to decide winners and losers if nobody gets a finish. That kind of creates a problem that the UFC has to address if they want to capture that spirit that makes fighting so exciting. If you only incentivize winning, why would anybody try to get a finish? If you can win by just scoring more points, you might as well turn it into a sparring match and do the bare minimum you need to win. Why take on the risk of getting countered and losing a fight by going for a finish? This is why so many fights look like sparring matches. And if people are going to tune in to watch a fight, they want to see a fight, not a sparring match. I think the UFC should still incentivize wins by guaranteeing higher base pay depending on what rank you're in. Your pay would go up as you move up in rank, so fighters would still have a reason to try and win. And the amount of money they make should be the same regardless of whether or not they win or lose. So get rid of the show money and win money split and give both fighters the same amount regardless of the result. Now, in order to incentivize finishes, the UFC should guarantee a bonus if you get a finish and make that bonus significantly higher for title fights. Right now, there are performance bonuses, but they only go to 1 or 2 people on a card. And for most fighters, the risk of fighting with an intent to finish just isn't worth it if there's like a 30% chance that they're going to get rewarded for it. So fighters wouldn't get punished for losing, they would be more likely to take risks, and they would have a guaranteed reward if they win by a finish. Obviously, this won't guarantee a finish in every fight, but it will move the finish rate in that direction. If you look at the UFC's YouTube channel, they post highlight reels that get impressive amounts of views that are orders of magnitude higher than their pay-per-view numbers. And it's not even just knockouts. There are plenty of videos dedicated to submissions that have insane amounts of views as well. Could you imagine how popular UFC events would be if people believed that what they're about to watch might resemble those highlight reels? Problem number 2, the pay-per-view model. There was an interesting survey done by The Athletic back in 2020 that gathered information about how UFC fans are watching pay-per-views. Only 34% of the people who watch pay-per-views pay for the event at their home on their personal streaming device. 22.6% watch in some kind of group like with friends or a bar, and 38.7%, the largest group, pirate them from illegal streaming sites. Only about 10% of self-described MMA fans consistently buy all of the pay-per-view events every year. And keep in mind, this was back in 2020 when pay-per-views were only $65. So these numbers might be even worse now that they cost $80 per event. There are so many MMA fans that are either not watching the UFC events or watching them for free illegally. So the UFC has to change something if they're going to get these people to buy their pay-per-views. They need to increase the value of their pay-per-views by either lowering the price or increasing the quality of their pay-per-view events, or ideally, do both. So how can the UFC make their events better? We already talked about a lot of ways that they can do that by changing the way they pay fighters to incentivize finishes, but there are other ways too. Some people think that this can be solved by simply having fewer events and stacking the cards more with better fights. Boxing, for example, has the same pay-per-view price as the UFC, and yet they consistently bring in more pay-per-view buys. One explanation for this is that they don't have nearly as many events, so when they do have events and their big stars are fighting, it draws in much more hype. This isn't a bad strategy. The UFC could have fewer events per year and maybe guarantee 2 champions fight per pay-per-view, and make some of the fights that would normally headline a fight night card be on the pay-per-views instead. While I think this could be a good strategy, I don't think it will work by itself. UFC 315 had Bilal Muhammad versus Jack Della Maddalena, with Valentina Shevchenko versus Manon Fiorot as the co-main. That's 2 title fights. Now, like I said, the UFC doesn't publicly disclose pay-per-view numbers from most of their events, but on one betting site, over 50% of people bet that it would get less than 60,000 buys. Obviously, that's not official, but if the pay-per-view buys were anywhere in that ballpark, that's absolutely abysmal. The fact is, people just don't care about Bilal Muhammad, Jack Della Maddalena, and the 2 ladies in the co-main to justify spending $80 plus the $10 for the ESPN Plus membership. Even if they stack the rest of the card with exciting fights, nobody's buying it. UFC 300 was supposedly the most stacked card of all time, and it still did less pay-per-view buys than McGregor vs. Poirier 3, which had 1.5 million pay-per-view buys, which is pretty good by today's standards, but still far from the UFC's potential. To be totally honest, even among the hardcore fans, I don't think there's anything the UFC can do to get the fans spending $90 a month to watch UFC pay-per-views. It's just too much, especially when illegal streams exist that you can watch for free, and it's impossible for the UFC to take legal action against all of those streams without new ones popping up. So the UFC really has to factor in that this option exists when they're pricing their events. From the fans' perspective, the cost of a pay-per-view is not the price to watch the event versus not watching the event live. That's the price of upgrading from your laggy, poor quality illegal stream to a reliable, high quality stream. And the irony is, ESPN Plus is notoriously bad. Because of the technical difficulties at UFC 313, tons of people who may have purchased the pay-per-view didn't do it. And UFC 306 was the first event to be streamed at 1080p. Seriously, in 2024, the UFC was streaming their events in 720p. How much would you actually be willing to spend to upgrade your stream from poor quality, laggy, and probably has a chance of freezing and maybe infecting your computer or phone with a virus to a high quality, reliable 4K stream? I don't know what you guys think, but I'm thinking $25 tops. Certainly not $90 though. And I also think the UFC should be a subscription rather than a pay-per-view. When it's a pay-per-view, people have to make a purchase and put their card in every single time they buy them. But if it were a subscription, there would be a lot of people paying the subscription service each month when they probably wouldn't have spent that money on a pay-per-view. For example, our more casual fans who buy, let's say 3 pay-per-views per year, like the big ones, 3 times 80, that's $240 per year. If instead of a pay-per-view costing $80, it was monthly subscription costing $25, those people might bite the bullet and subscribe to access those fights, plus some others that they don't really care about, and end up spending $300 a year, which is more than they were before. Especially if this subscription was bundled with a streaming service they were already paying for, like Amazon Prime or Netflix. Now you might say, well, maybe a smaller number of customers paying the full $90 generates more revenue than a larger number of customers spending $25 per month. And that might be the case. If the UFC switched over to a subscription model, they would certainly lose revenue from their whales. But for reference, the price I'm proposing, $25, is the same price as a premium subscription for NBA League Pass, and the NBA generates almost 10 times as much revenue as the UFC. So in short, the UFC can make their events more stacked by having less of them per month and having a higher concentration of higher ranking or more competitive fights on each card. And they can replace the pay-per-view model with a subscription model to get more regular customers at a low enough price point to where it's worth upgrading your glitchy illegal stream to a high quality, reliable 4K stream. Fortunately, this is a great time for the UFC to rethink their monetization model because their current deal with ESPN is expiring this year. At the moment, it seems like Netflix and Amazon are the front runners, though Netflix is probably in the lead, given that they just signed a deal with the WWE, who's owned by the same company as the UFC. So let's say the UFC makes a deal with Netflix, where people can pay for a UFC Netflix subscription package. A standard Netflix subscription costs $18 a month, so with that $25 add-on for the UFC content, it would cost $43 a month to get both Netflix and access to all of UFC events. So for an additional $25 a month on your Netflix or Amazon Prime subscription, you would get 3 exciting events on a reliable, high-quality stream, and by incentivizing finishes with a competitive subscription price, it'd be much more approachable to new fans. And then promote the hell out of it by just posting highlights on social media after the events. The UFC has already started doing this a lot more on their YouTube channel, but with these incentives, there would simply be more finishes to use as promotional content. I think over time, the UFC would become more approachable to casual fans while also staying interesting to the more hardcore fans. We would see more fights that capture that spirit of fighting that makes the UFC so special. Let me know your thoughts on this. I'm curious to hear what ideas you guys have. Obviously, I'm not a business expert, so maybe my ideas aren't sustainable for the UFC. That may be true, but it's also true that the UFC is kind of taking a dive right now. If you want to see me make more videos, one of the ways you can do that is by becoming a channel member. It's $3, and you also get access to my weekly betting breakdowns on my community page. Thanks for watching.